Good afternoon and welcome. This is Dr. James Rippey. It is my pleasure to serve as a moderator for today's webinar, which will be delivered by Dr. John Erdman. I will be formally introducing him in a few moments. The webinar is entitled, Does Tomato or Lycopene Intake Reduce the Risk of Prostate Cancer? This webinar is part of an ongoing NutriBite webinar series, which is brought to you by Conagra Nutrition. Our mission statement is, we believe that everyone deserves easy access to understandable, credible, and science-based nutrition information. I would now like to turn the webinar over to my colleague, Amy Continelli, who will give you some logistical information about today's webinar. Amy.
Thank you, Dr. Rippey. CEUs, a link to obtain your continuing education credit certificate will be available on this webinar's page at conagranutrition.com and emailed to you within 2 business days. A recording of today's webinar and slides as a PDF will be available to download within 2 business days at, again, conagranutrition.com. The presenter will answer questions at the end of this webinar. Please submit your questions by using the chat dialog box on your computer screen. Thank you, Dr. Rippey.
Thank you, Amy. As I mentioned, today's faculty is Dr. John Erdman. I will be formally introducing him momentarily. This is a CEU credit for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, so I am obliged to specifically list the learning objectives from the webinar. They are the following 4 items. Number 1, what is the function of the prostate, and why are men prone to prostate enlargement and cancer? Number 2, what is the epidemiologic evidence linking higher intake of tomato products or lycopene to lower the risk of prostate cancer? Number 3, have preclinical and small clinical trials with tomato or lycopene provided evidence for reduced risk of prostate cancer? Number 4, what should I advise young and older men about diet and prostate cancer risk? It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Erdman. Dr. Erdman is Emeritus Professor of Food Science and Human Nutrition, Professor of Internal Medicine, and Professor of Nutrition in the Division of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana. Dr. Erdman's training and expertise encompass the nutritional and physiological biochemistry of man and animals. He has authored over 200 original research articles on these subjects and has over 250 total publications, including other articles and chapters. He is senior editor of the 10th edition, Present Knowledge of Nutrition, which is published in 2012. Dr. Erdman received his BS, MS, MPH, and PhD in food science at Rutgers University. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Erdman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rippey. And I look forward to our interactions today. I'll be presenting a number of slides, and then, as mentioned before, if you have questions, please send them in, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So I'm trying to advance the slide here. We just heard about the learning objectives. We're going to talk about prostate and cancer risk, the epidemiological evidence. I will review a few of the preclinical trials, particularly about tomato and lycopene, and then what to advise our male population. So as an overall presentation outline, first going to talk about carotenoids. Why are they important in nature? Then move on to tomatoes and review the nutrient content of tomatoes. Spend the most time on the experimental information that supports a reduced risk of prostate cancer with tomatoes and lycopene. A little bit on the mechanisms, and we decided to also discuss a little bit about tomatoes and heart disease risk, look at some of the data looking at stability of lycopene during food processing of tomatoes, and then get to the conclusions. So there are over 650 carotenoids in nature. Most of them are very colorful, so many of our yellow, orange, and red pigments throughout nature are carotenoids. We tend to consume 30 or 40 of them on a regular basis in our food supply. The coloration of birds and insects is critical for those species, particularly for identification. If you're the opposite sex, indicates that they're hardy and they're sexually mature. For those of us that shop, we look for the color in fruits and vegetables to indicate ripeness. And carotenoids are also precursors to a number of aroma compounds. So, for example, in roses, there may be several hundred chemicals that make up the smell of an individual rose. Most of those are derived from carotenoids, and also some carotenoids act as plant hormones. So here's a picture of a number of birds. These colors are not made directly by the birds. They require the birds to forage appropriately to consume foods that contain those carotenoids and therefore become attracted to the opposite sex. Besides fruits and vegetables, other plant compounds like fungi, there's a number of colorful ones here, make their own carotenoids. Humans, of course, cannot. How about a role in health? Carotenoids are essential for the photosynthetic process. So during photosynthesis, carotenoids are a major provider of light harvesting, the photons of light, and also protection for the plant. Some of the carotenoids, like beta-carotene, can be metabolized to vitamin A, and at least in vitro, in a test tube, many carotenoids, particularly lycopene, are powerful antioxidants and powerful singlet oxygen quenchers. It's not at all clear, actually, whether in our human body they're acting as antioxidants, and we'll get back to that later. And carotenoids may well play major health aspects beyond just provision of vitamin A. So here's a picture of our campus in Urbana. I'm happy at this point that our trees are not turning yet, but they will in another week or two. And sometimes people wonder where these orange and reds come from. Well, the carotenoids are part of our chloroplasts. They're always there, but you don't see these colors because there's so much chlorophyll. The chlorophyll is green, and when the weather gets cold, we start losing the chlorophyll. It dies off, and it reveals the carotenoids underneath. Eventually, the leaves turn brown because the carotenoids also are oxidized. So there's no test on chemical formulas here, but I did want to make the point that there are a number of common dietary sources of carotenoids, and that most of them are just hydrogen-carbon. So lycopene, which is a focus today, is a hydrocarbon with many double bonds. Beta-carotene actually has the same structure formula as lycopene, and lycopene is a precursor in plants to beta-carotene. And we know beta-carotene comes from pumpkins and sweet potato and carrots. Lutein, you begin to add some oxygen, in this case hydroxyl compounds, and lutein is very prevalent in the green leafy vegetables, and also the color of egg yolk. So here's lots of colors from some of our common fruits and vegetables. Not all of them are carotenoids, but most are. So we typically think about tomatoes, and when we do, we think about lycopene. Well, lycopene is a predominant carotenoid, but and it also tomatoes provide about 80% of the lycopene intake in the United States. There aren't that many of our fruits and vegetables that contain lycopene. Watermelon, pink grapefruit, etc. There's a few of them that do. Tomatoes are only second to potatoes in consumption if we look at all fruits, vegetables, and melons. And about 85% of tomatoes are processed into various of our common products that we're familiar with, juices, purees, sauces. And tomatoes, as Gary Beecher said a few years ago, provides a very convenient matrix by which nutrients and other health-related food components can be supplied to human beings. But there's lots more in the tomato, not just lycopene. Our lab has been very interested in two other carotenoids. This is phytoene and phytofluene that are fairly high concentrations in tomato. They happen to be colorless, but they're also important. I think of interest is some of these other nutrients. So vitamin C, K, and E are not found in very, very high concentrations in tomatoes, but we eat so many tomato products that they make up a very important contribution to our intake of these vitamins. It's also potassium, and of note, there's a number of non-essential compounds such as flavonoids, and they are very, very helpful as well in humans, and probably a subject of another presentation webinar at some point. This is a listing of some of the top lycopene-containing foods, and if we start from the bottom, you'll see, say, a single cherry tomato. If you have a red one, we happen to have some yellow ones in our garden. About 0.4 of a milligram. And as you move up, you'll see some other common foods. At the top, a half cup of canned tomato puree contains over 27 milligrams of lycopene. Now, the main subject of the webinar, of course, then is how do tomato and lycopene intake play a role with prostate cancer? We know from years and years of epidemiological studies that there's an association of the consumption of fruits and vegetables broadly that are high in carotenoids with a lower risk of cancer. So that's all cancers. There are not very many associations of specific foods or carotenoids with cancer, with the exception of tomato intake and association with lower risk of prostate cancer. So our laboratory, my graduate students and I published 2 papers last year where we did systematic review and meta-analysis of the literature. In this particular paper, we looked at the effects of increasing the dietary intake of either lycopene or the circulating levels and other serum levels of lycopene, and how that might be associated with reduced prostate cancer risk. There were 39 studies that were made the cut, so to speak, to be part of this systematic review. And if you look at the left side, this evaluates the impact of dietary lycopene. So many different trials in many different countries and many different laboratories. And if you combine all that data, you'll see that for those individuals consuming a higher versus a lower intake, there was about a 12% lower risk of prostate cancer. And in addition, a 1% reduced risk was seen for each additional 2 milligrams of lycopene consumed. As you saw from our previous slide, half cup of tomato paste is going to provide 10 times that amount. For circulating lycopene or serum lycopene, we see that high levels versus low levels, again, a very similar 12% lowered risk. And there is a dose response statistically that we found with each 10 micrograms per deciliter increase, we see a lower risk of about 3.5%. So our lab also looked at tomato consumption in a separate paper. And here you see on the left side total tomato consumption, and you'll see about a 19% lower risk of prostate cancer for those consuming high versus low levels. And we also found a significant dose response. So the more of total tomato product consumed per week, you had lower risk. And if you look on the right-hand side, we looked at different tomato products, and both cooked tomatoes and sauces, which are cooked, there was about 16% lower risk, and there was also a dose response there. Now of note is that eating raw tomatoes, there was no significant reduction in prostate cancer risk when individual labs looked at just consuming fresh or raw tomatoes, and we'll get back to that as well. You might be asking, so what is the prostate? What does it do? Where is it? This cartoon shows the prostate. It's a walnut-sized gland that sits underneath the bladder, and the bladder, of course, collects urine. Unfortunately, I would say, from an anatomical standpoint, the urethra, which drains the urine out of the bladder so you can urinate, goes right through the middle of the prostate. Now, there's a purpose for that, of course, is the prostate does provide fluids for seminal secretions. But the prostate in older men grows, sometimes in a benign way, a non-cancerous way, and it squeezes off the urethra. And all of us have seen numerous commercials on TV for advertising products like finasteride that will lower the incidence of benign prostate hyperplasia, which is the disease it's called, and helps men urinate better. We're more focused on cancer, and of course, if you have cancer in the prostate, then that also enlarges the prostate, and eventually one can get metastasis or movement in that cancer to other places in the body, such as bones and liver, etc. So here's one of my favorite cartoons, Shoe. And as you can see, question is, or comment is, it's funny how things switch when we get older. And Shoe says, well, what do you mean? Oh, there was a time when it was my muscles that were big and my prostate that was small. So this is obviously an issue in men and common enough to have a cartoon. The risk statistics are shown in this slide. These statistics are compilated every year by the CDC. And you can see on the left-hand side of this slide that in blue, where you have the number of cases per year, there's approximately 180,000 men diagnosed every year in the United States for prostate cancer. it's the highest of all cancers in rate of diagnosis. In the gray, the deaths you can see are lower than, say, lung and esophageal, and about comparable to colorectal cancer. I guess the good news is that prostate cancer is a developmental cancer over 2 to 3 decades. So if diagnosed early, and it often is, there's things you can do about that and prevent men from having death. And that's, of course, an opportunity for interventions such as dietary interventions. So 1 in 7 men will be diagnosed with prostate cancer in their lifetime. And it should be noted that most men in their 70s probably have prostate cancer, at least 50% of them, but it's at such a low stage it won't be a cause of death. So on the right-hand side, we're looking at risk factors. And some are modifiable and some are not. So over age 65 and being an African-American male and living in the U.S. and having a family history of prostate cancer is something you can't do anything about. But there are modifiable. Smoking is correlated with prostate cancer, just like it is in many other cancers. Being overweight and obese is also correlated. And of course, diet. There's definitely some things in diet that you can do, change to lower your risk. I've always found this data very fascinating. It's a little bit dated, but still makes a very important point. People often wonder what's the role of genetics versus the role of environment in prostate cancer. So if you look at the figure, this is a rate of cancer per 100,000 individuals. And the top, you see Chinese men in Shanghai with a very low rate, yet Chinese men in Singapore have a 5 times the rate. You'd think genetically they're probably very similar. And then you can see other countries, and you get up to the U.S., and the rate is 10 times higher than in Singapore. And African American males have the highest rate of cancer in the world. So some of this is genetics, but I would conclude a lot of it is not. This addresses somewhat the same point. So it shows, and this is not a political map, by the way. It's a standardized prostate incidence map. And if you're in a red country, you have a very high rate of cancer. And if it's green, and particularly dark green, it's very low rate of cancer. And there's a huge difference between those rates. And again, I would conclude it's partially, but not all genetics. It's lifestyle, and which would include diet. I'm going to present just results from a few trials that we have carried out in our laboratory at the University of Illinois here, mainly in conjunction with our collaborators at Ohio State University. And in this particular trial, which is our first one to test tomato and lycopene, it's a chemically induced cancer in rats. You probably don't need to know the details of how it was done, but we tested tomato powder, lycopene supplement, and the lycopene actually was provided at 10 times the level of the amount of lycopene in tomato powder, and versus a controlled diet. And this was a long-term study. The major outcome of the study is how many animals were still surviving. So you can see from the y-axis or the left side, the number of alive, and this is actually mostly histologically confirmed cancer. The green dots represent the control group, or placebo group. Only 10% alive after a year. The red are the lycopene, is a lycopene diet, and at the end about 17% improvement in survival, but overall the survival was not different than the control. Whereas the blue was a tomato powder, and that was statistically significant. There was about a 37% improvement in survival over this time period. This is a different type of study with Copenhagen rats. This is called a transplantable tumor study, where an original prostate tumor from a rat was saved, and the tissue is then used in additional studies, and the tissue is actually injected into the flanks or the sides of the animals. And because it came from the same strain of animals, that will grow to a tumor. So we would carry out that surgery and then test the effects of a variety of different diets on the growth of the tumor. So the main endpoint is the growth of tumors, and can we slow it down? Remember, I said before, the prostate cancer develops over decades. So if we can slow down the rate of the cancer, we can prevent adverse events. So here again, I show the final results. The blue bar, way to the left, is a control group, and we assign the growth of those tumors as 100%. And then all the other groups are associated with it. In this study, low lycopene, and we fed the same amount of lycopene as in the tomato group. So the orange had the same amount of lycopene that was in the red group. No effect. We had 10-fold higher lycopene, which is in sort of the purplish color. There was some drop, but not significantly different. Tomatoes, 10% tomato, worked very well. We also tested broccoli here. 10% broccoli was great. 5% of each worked pretty well. 10% of each worked extremely well. And interestingly, finasteride, which I mentioned before is one of those drugs they sell on TV, was not as good. It did not have as much impact as the dietary intervention. If you castrate the animals, which is the source of androgens, and I'll get to that in a second, you dramatically lose the amount of tumor tissue. So when we had our conclusion of that particular study, we said, well, broccolis and tomato, eat them together, life will be better. So here's a study. Our more recent model has been a transgenic mouse model. Again, the details don't matter too much for the webinar, but all these animals will get prostate cancer. And we compared control animals, tomato powder, in this case a soy germ. Soy also is associated, soy intake is associated with lower prostate cancer risk. What we did, we gave them together. And those diets were fed from 4 to 18 weeks, and the animals were taken down at 18 weeks. And then we said, well, what's the incidence of cancer? So 100% of the animals in the control group got cancer. Tomato powder group, there was a 40% reduction in risk. The soy germ, again, about 40%, and together almost 50% reduction in carcinogenesis. Last study that I'm going to mention, but I think a good take-home point, we did a Another study with the tramp mice did exactly the same sort of studies we did in the last one, but we fed a tomato powder that was very low in lycopene, extremely low. And what do we find? Essentially, there was no impact on growth of those tumors and carcinogenesis. So it's pretty clear to us, and at least in these animal models, that lycopene needs to be present in the tomato powder to be effective. That's not to say that lycopene is the only component, because there are others that are important, and we actually feel that there's synergy between these components. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about mechanisms, but a little bit, because I think many of you will be interested in this. Male hormones. So just like estrogens are the primary driver of endometrial and breast cancer, in men, androgens or testosterone or DHT are the driver of cancer, but they're also essential for the growth of the normal prostate. So you need enough of androgens to have a normal prostate for men, but primary cancers that develop require androgens. They always require a lot of androgens. So it's a double-edged sword. We need androgens, but we don't want too much. Our lab and others as well have provided some evidence that both tomato and lycopene consumption reduce the androgen-dependent prostate cancer growth. So we think there's some anti-androgen effects of lycopene and tomato. In addition, work I'm not going to show here is we've looked at lipid metabolism, particularly cholesterol metabolism, and it is known that tomatoes and lycopene enhance in a good way lipid metabolism, and that may be also one of the mechanisms. And we also feel, and I'm not going to show any data, that it's really the metabolites of lycopene that appear to be the active forms of lycopene, not lycopene itself, but the normal metabolites once the lycopene is absorbed into the body and metabolized. So I thought I'd just put on a few slides related to cardiovascular disease. If you look at the whole body of epidemiological evidence, it does demonstrate that higher intake of carotenoid-rich fruits and vegetables are consistently associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, just like I said for prostate cancer. Tomatoes, again, consumption appears to be related to reduced cardiovascular disease risk. I'm just going to talk about one study, the REMIX study, which was published 10 years ago now by Kohlmeyer and coworkers. This is work done in 10 different European countries. The goal was to analyze carotenoid concentrations in fat tissue, the adipose tissue, in men who had their first heart attack or myocardial infarction. So men were recruited from 10 countries. They were over 70 years of age, under 70 years of age, and they were followed prospectively. Controls were age matched in 5-year intervals. What was done, very creative study, when men arrived at the hospital with a myocardial infarction or a heart attack, they were, after approval, had a needle biopsy and took some adipose tissue out to analyze for carotenoids. And they did many other measurements as well. including smoking and if there was a familiar history, etc., of heart disease. The results were pretty surprising, I think, even to the investigators. Cases were more likely to be overweight, of course, in smokers and men that reported a family history. That's not surprising. The surprising and pertinent to our talk is after adjustments for age and smoking and those sorts of things, lycopene was the only carotenoid that appeared to have a significant protective effect. In other words, the higher the lycopene in adipose tissue, the more protection. And it was halving of the risk. Just a couple of years ago, Britt Freeman from up in Chicago and CESO published a very nice paper, I believe it was in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, asking the questions about whole tomato versus lycopene supplements and cardiovascular risk factors. And their conclusions from a number of clinical trials were as follows. Clinical research results support consumption of tomato-based foods for cardiovascular health. The lycopene supplements appeared to be best for control of blood pressure management, while all the other cardiovascular risk endpoints, such as cholesterol, etc., favored tomato intake. So not only is there evidence in the arena for reduction in risk of prostate cancer, but also for a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. I'm going to share a few slides related to food processing. Remind you again, there's a large range of lycopene content in tomato products as processed. This is, I thought, a very interesting trial that came out of Ohio State University, where subjects were asked to go on a low carotenoid-containing diet for a week or so, and then at week 0, as you can see in this figure, they were placed, they were continued on a low carotenoid diet, but they received in the red diamonds a daily supplement of tomato sauce, in the blue V8 juice, and in the kind of purplish tomato soup. As you can see, and what we're measuring here is serum or plasma lycopene. Over the 2 weeks of the study, plasma lycopene went up dramatically in the tomato sauce group, much more dramatically than the other two groups. After 2 weeks, the subjects were taken off that supplement, and you can see a slow lowering of that plasma level. The main point here is, even though these individuals received approximately the same amount of lycopene, there was a tremendous difference in the bioavailability, that is, the plasma response to the lycopene. So this shows very clearly that the more processed, in this case, of tomato sauce, which also contained probably a little bit more fat, the better the absorption. Of course, too much heat can cause problems. So lycopene can be degraded, can be isomerized, the molecule, and decomposed by oxidation. And there are factors that play a role in degradation. Excess heat, as we'll see in a second, excess light and oxygen. And the food matrix is generally protective, particularly if you have whole tomato that's being cooked. This shows a figure where here's lycopene content on the y-axis, and then hours cooked. And you can see that there are different temperatures. These are processed tomato puree. You would never process it normally this long unless you're cooking your tomato sauce on the stove for hours. And of course, you wouldn't go above 100 C. But these are canned products. I think the point here is in the circles, which is the highest temperature. After 6 hours, there's no lycopene retained, whereas at lower temperatures, it's retained. So there's some lability of the lycopene. This shows tomato powder stored for 20 days and the total lycopene, and it's either stored in nitrogen atmosphere, so there's no oxygen available, versus in the air. And you could see that even in 30 days storage, if you just store in the air covered, you're going to lose half of your lycopene, and then over time you lose more. This, I think, is interesting because on the left side we have some thermal processed products. How much? And the question is, how much of the carotenoids are retained? It goes down versus the blue bar, which is a control. But ascorbic acid goes down even more quickly. So vitamin C is much more labile to heat than is lycopene, but lycopene is lost to some degree as well. So one might ask, cooked or raw? Well, mild cooking enhances absorption of lycopene from the tomato, and this is actually the case for a number of food components. So, raw is not necessarily better. And how many servings? 3 or more servings a week appears to be best. So in a summary of the food processing part, food processing have higher lycopene, processed tomato products have higher lycopene and bioavailability than the raw. Lycopene remains relatively stable during typical processing procedures, but if you're cooking it on your stove for hours, not so much. Excess heat, light, and oxygen can decrease lycopene and particularly vitamin C during food processing. So we all know about the apple a day. Well, an apple a day plus 4 or more servings of other fruits and vegetables, particularly tomatoes, may in fact keep the doctor away. And here's the bereaved dependent, the doctor is talking to her. I was able to give one more lecture on diet and exercise. Well, hopefully the lectures before have some impact on most of the men that we all know. So what should we recommend for young and older men? The epidemiological evidence strongly suggests that consumption of tomato products early in life is protective. So we don't have any data prior to 20 years of age. But the data from long prospective trials from Harvard School of Public Health, for example, suggests the early consumption is better. The good news, I think, is that tomato protection is more associated with more advanced, aggressive cancers, and that's what you might die of. One might ask about the most advanced cancers. This is after men have been treated, say, by radiation or prostatectomy or drugs or a combination. They're cancer-free for a while, and then the cancer comes back. This is called castration-resistant prostate cancer. Our lab is just beginning the last 2 years to study this in our animal models. Very little work has been done on that, and we don't have results yet. The data is really right now at the biostatistician, and so stay tuned. So, how about supplements versus whole foods? Are they the same? My conclusion is they are not. Lycopene is just one component. It doesn't contain all the goodies that a tomato contains. So, a couple overall conclusions. Tomato products contain a variety of important nutrients. Lycopene certainly is one of the primary bioactive components. Cooking tomatoes with some fat enhances bioavailability. Tomato consumption appears to have a number of positive and yet no negative health effects unless you're allergic to tomatoes. And tomato and usually lycopene have been shown to suppress prostate carcinogenesis. And small human clinical trials are encouraging. There's no big intervention trials. They cost tens of millions of dollars. So we don't have any of that data. Metabolites of lycopene appear to be the most biologically active form. And the potential of lycopene modes of action include regulation of genes related to androgen metabolism and signaling and in improvement of lipid metabolism. So I want to acknowledge very quickly Ohio State University, many of my former students and current students and other labs, as well as funding. And hope you enjoyed the presentation and have lots of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Erdman, for a very interesting and enlightening presentation. We have multiple questions, and so I'll just get started right away. First question, what is the lycopene content of non-red tomatoes? For example, black, green, or even yellow. Any benefit except color variety and good flavor?
Excellent question. So the yellow tomatoes, which I mentioned we have in our own yard, they have a different form of lycopene. It's called a tetracis lycopene, and that's the conformation's different. And therefore it's yellow rather than red. And Ohio State is actually doing a study right now to see if the yellow ones reduce risk of cancer. The purple and black ones are high in flavonoids. I showed a structure of that earlier, and we don't know, nobody's done analysis of those vis-a-vis cancer.
Okay, thank you. Next question. You indicated that a higher intake or consumption of tomatoes significantly lowers the risk of cancer, parentheses by 12%. What, in terms of a quantifying amount, is a high weekly intake of tomatoes? By this I mean how many, 100 grams or cups?
So I guess the easiest way to answer that is servings. And the data suggests at least 3 servings a week of tomato products. And so a half cup of puree, I think, is a serving. And so you have to go look at the USDA database to see what a serving is. But it's actually easily achievable. The trouble is a lot of men don't do it, and maybe some women don't do it either. It's pretty achievable to get 3 servings a week.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I'm wondering if Dr. Erdman has an opinion on the tomato having a nightshade vegetable containing lectins and their so-called disruptive effect on the GI system. I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Perhaps you do, Dr. Erdman.
Was it lectins?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mentioned some people are allergic to tomatoes, and it may be due to the lectins. They irritate the gut a little bit. But the amount in tomatoes is quite low compared to other foods. So I think it would be a rather minor impact, and then self-regulated for people who don't digest the tomatoes very well.
Thank you. Next question. Does lycopene have the same phytoestrogens that soy does? Is this why it is effective in prevention and management of prostate cancer?
So soy has a totally different array of phytochemicals. So they're primarily the isoflavones. And most people, and we've done a little work in our lab, feel that the isoflavones are the compounds that lower the risk of prostate cancer in men. So there are green, so the edamame has some small amounts of carotenoids, beta-carotene mainly, but there would be no lycopene at all there. and would have then a different mode of action.
Next question. Oftentimes cooked tomatoes products are high in sodium. How do you recommend dietitians advise older African American men who have hypertension?
That's a super question. So ketchup comes to mind right away, in moderation there, because ketchup is quite high in sodium, and pizza also, not necessarily from the tomato sauce, but from the rest of the pizza. So I would go with the pastas and the sauces and the tomato pieces, which are going to be much lower in sodium. But ketchup would be very high, and pizza would be high.
Thank you. Next question. What is the reason that African American men have a higher rate of prostate cancer?
So I think that's multifold. One, and this is probably something we definitely have to fix, is that African American men are diagnosed later than non-African American men. It's a health disparity that needs to be fixed. The rate of smoking is higher. Probably consumption of foods that are increasing risk, and less foods that decrease risk probably plays a role too. And there may be some genetics involved as well. But access to diagnosis early is something that we really have to fix in this nation.
Thank you. Next question. Is the study on cardiovascular disease only in men, or does it also include women?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I should have made that point. So, yeah, that particular study focused more on men, but there are a number of other studies out there that, show equal impacts in men and women.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How does the lycopene content vary in vine-ripened tomatoes, parentheses, home garden, versus store tomatoes that are not dark red?
So always better to get it off the vine. I will say that 10 years ago, the store-bought tomatoes in the winter were really low. And that was in part, I think, the varieties that were being used and the shipping systems. They're much better now and higher in lycopene, and you can see the difference. So it's very visual. So if you cut into the tomato and it's only got kind of reddish toward the outside, and it's not going to have as much lycopene. It's the same thing with watermelon. I mean, my wife and I just bought some earlier this week and cut it open, and very disappointed. It was, almost blanched white in there. So you can see by the color, but it's better. The store-bought ones are better than they used to be.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Where does female cancer health come in this discussion? Do tomatoes help with other types of cancer, such as breast cancer?
Very good question. The answer is we don't know, because there's not been a lot of work. Part of the reason, not because we're against studying breast cancer, but the epidemiological evidence doesn't support so much tomato products and lower risk of endometrial or breast or cervical cancer. So it hasn't been studied very much. So actually we don't know that much about it.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we have time for only one more question. So this question is, you mentioned that tomato and lycopene have anti-adrenergic activity. Is this a concern at all for very young boys?
Well, I would say not. Particularly, pizza seems to be the number one food for teenagers. That's just a little kidding aside. It's a modest effect. and I don't think there's any evidence at all that we worry about developmental aspects. The same thing in soy. People worry somewhat about developmental aspects in men and women, and there's really no evidence for that.
Thank you, Dr. Erdman. Well, let's now move on to some closing slides. I want to repeat the objectives, which we hope were met in this webinar. And so based on this webinar, the participants should be able to do the following 4 things, or know the following 4 things. What is the function of the prostate, and why are men prone to prostate enlargement and cancer? Number 2, what is the epidemiologic evidence linking higher intake of tomato products or lycopene to lower risk of prostate cancer? Number 3, have preclinical and small clinical trials with tomato or lycopene provided evidence for reduced risk of prostate cancer? Number 4, what should I advise young and older men about diet and prostate cancer risk? I would now like to turn the webinar back over to my colleague Amy Continelli, who will repeat the logistical information concerning CEUs. Amy?
Thank you, Dr. Rippey. A link to obtain your continuing education credit certificate will be available on our website and emailed to you within 2 business days. Today's webinar will be available to download within 2 business days at ConAgraNutrition.com. If you do have any questions or concerns regarding the CPE information, feel free to email me directly. And we do have a number of recent CEU webinars archived at the ConAgra Nutrition website. Thank you, Dr. Rippey.
Thank you, Amy. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this webinar is part of an ongoing ConAgra Nutrition NutriBite webinar series. So we are pleased to announce that these happen once every quarter, and we're pleased to announce that we have the next one lined up already. It is being delivered by Joanne Slavin from the University of Minnesota, and it's entitled Digestive Health, Gut Microbiota, and Fermented Foods. What does the science say? This is available to be registered. You can register for that now by going to our website, ConAgraNutrition.com. I would like to ask our audience, first of all, let me thank Dr. Erdman for a very interesting and enlightening webinar. As a cardiologist, I always find that I learn important things about these, and a man. So I learned both some very good information about tomatoes and lycopene and prostate cancer, but also about some interesting things about nutrition and cardiovascular medicine. So thank you, Dr. Erdman, for a very enlightening webinar. So we always ask our participants, we know you've given your valuable time to participate in the webinar, but we would like you to stay on the line for 1 more minute and just fill out a survey to let us know how we're doing with this webinar, and also give us ideas about future webinars that you would like us to sponsor. So once again, thank you to our audience, and thank you to Dr. Erdman, and have a good rest of the day.